Nobody questioned why the church organist always sat where she could see every entrance. They should have. When the first gunshot shattered the sacred silence of St. Peter's Methodist Church on that October morning, Margaret Hartley's arthritis-gnarled fingers didn't tremble. Instead, they moved with deadly precision to a hidden compartment beside her organ bench, retrieving a weapon that had been waiting 40 years for this moment. The congregation screamed and dove for cover, but Margaret's steel-gray eyes remained calm, calculating angles and distances with the cold efficiency of someone who had once been the Army's deadliest sniper. 3 armed terrorists had just made the mistake of their lives. They thought they were attacking defenseless worshippers. They had no idea they'd walked into the crosshairs of a ghost from America's most classified operations. Welcome to One Human, One Story. Before we continue with this powerful story of hidden valor and deadly precision, have you ever encountered someone who appeared ordinary but harbored extraordinary secrets? Someone whose quiet strength ran deeper than anyone could imagine? Let us know in the comments what you think makes a true hero. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who protect others from the shadows. Margaret Hartley had been playing the organ at St. Peter's Methodist Church for 32 years, but that Sunday morning would redefine everything the congregation thought they knew about their soft-spoken organist. Every Sunday for over 3 decades, she had climbed those narrow wooden stairs to the organ loft, her weathered hands carrying the same worn hymnal she'd treasured since 1992. Her silver hair was always pulled back in an immaculate bun, secured with a simple tortoiseshell clip that had belonged to her mother. Her floral dresses were pressed to perfection, her sensible black shoes polished until they gleamed, and her reading glasses hung from a delicate gold chain around her neck. To the 87 regular congregants of St. Peter's Methodist Church, she was simply Mrs. Hartley, the quiet widow who had moved to their small Indiana town decades ago, who made beautiful music that could bring tears to your eyes, and who never caused any trouble or drew attention to herself. But Margaret's careful positioning in that elevated loft wasn't about acoustics or long-standing church tradition, as most people assumed. From her strategic perch 20 feet above the main floor, she maintained clear sight lines to all 3 entrances: the heavy oak double doors at the back of the sanctuary where most visitors entered, the side entrance near the altar that connected to the pastor's study, and the smaller door that led from the fellowship hall where the coffee and donuts were served after services. Her fingers might have been playing centuries-old hymns of faith and devotion, but her eyes were constantly scanning, cataloging every face, assessing every movement, measuring distances and calculating angles with the unconscious precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such observations. This particular Sunday started with an unusual chill in the air, despite the late October warmth that had lingered through the week. The autumn light filtered through the magnificent stained glass windows that had been installed in 1923, casting jeweled shadows of ruby, sapphire, and emerald across the honey-colored wooden pews. Each window told a story from the Bible: the Good Shepherd, the Sermon on the Mount, the Resurrection, and Margaret knew every detail of those stories, just as she knew every creak of the old building, every hiding spot a child might choose during the Christmas pageant, every loose floorboard that groaned under heavy footsteps. Pastor Williams was preparing for his weekly sermon on forgiveness, a topic that always made Margaret's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, though no one had ever noticed this subtle reaction. Some things, she believed after 40 years of carrying certain memories, were simply unforgivable. The 23-year-old pastor, fresh from seminary and full of idealistic faith in human redemption, had no idea that the woman who provided the musical backdrop to his messages about turning the other cheek had once eliminated 37 threats to American security with surgical precision in conflicts that officially never existed. The congregation was settling into their familiar routines, when Margaret's trained eye caught something that made her pulse quicken for the first time in years. 3 men had entered the sanctuary, and everything about their presence screamed danger to someone who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle language of threat assessment. They wore dark jackets despite the unseasonably warm October weather, a classic tell for concealed weapons. More importantly, they entered separately, but moved with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military training and careful planning. The first man slipped through the main entrance during the opening prayer, choosing a seat in the back pew where he could monitor everyone entering or leaving. The second and third came through the side door near the altar, splitting to opposite sides of the sanctuary to create a crossfire pattern that any tactical specialist would recognize immediately. Margaret's fingers never missed a note of "How Great Thou Art," the opening hymn that had become as automatic as breathing after 3 decades of Sunday performances. But her pulse had shifted into a rhythm she hadn't felt since her final classified mission in 1984. Muscle memory and adrenaline were awakening systems that had been dormant for 40 years, and every detail of the sanctuary suddenly came into sharp tactical focus. The first man had chosen his position with deadly efficiency. Back left corner, clear view of both the altar and the main exit, his right hand resting inside his jacket in a way that seemed casual to untrained eyes, but telegraphed a concealed weapon to anyone who knew what to look for. Margaret cataloged his details automatically. Approximately 35 years old, 6 feet tall, athletic build suggesting regular physical training, eyes that moved constantly but never seemed to actually focus on the hymnal he was pretending to hold. His breathing was controlled, his posture alert, despite his attempted appearance of casual worship. The second man had positioned himself near the center aisle with clear access to the altar where Pastor Williams stood, his location chosen to create a bottleneck if anyone tried to flee toward the front of the church. Mid-40s, broader build, with the kind of patient stillness that came from extensive tactical training. He was the anchor point of their formation, Margaret realized, the one designed to hold position while the others moved. The third man, the leader, Margaret's experience told her, had taken a seat where he could see both the congregation and all the exits while maintaining visual contact with his partners. Early 30s, lean and predatory, with the kind of controlled energy that preceded violent action. She watched him scan the congregation with professional assessment, counting heads, identifying potential problems, calculating variables. His gaze lingered on her organ loft for a moment, but like most people, he saw only an elderly woman in a floral dress playing church music and dismissed her as irrelevant to his plans. That would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. As Pastor Williams began his opening prayer, Margaret made her own silent assessment of the tactical situation. 87 people in attendance today, including 15 children ranging in age from 6-month-old baby Emma Rodriguez to 17-year-old Tyler Chen, who was visiting with his grandmother. Mrs. Patterson, with her aluminum walker, would be the slowest to evacuate. She always sat in the third pew on the right, near the center aisle for easy access, and would need at least 90 seconds to reach either exit under normal circumstances. The Johnson family, with their 4 young children, always claimed the front row, putting them farthest from safety, but closest to the side exit that led to Pastor Williams's study. Margaret's mental calculations included trajectory angles from her position, potential civilian casualties from ricochets off the marble surfaces, the acoustic properties of the sanctuary that would affect her ability to track movement by sound, and the fact that her arthritis medication meant her hands might not be as steady as they once were. But some skills transcend physical limitations, and some muscle memories never fade. The men waited with professional patience as the service proceeded through its familiar rhythms. Pastor Williams delivered the announcements. Mrs. Chen was recovering well from her hip surgery. The youth group needed volunteers for their fundraising car wash. The church council would meet Tuesday evening to discuss the new sound system. The congregation sang hymns, took communion, and settled in for the sermon on forgiveness. Everything proceeded normally for 37 minutes and 15 seconds. Then the first gunshot shattered the sacred silence of St. Peter's Methodist Church. The sound exploded through the sanctuary like thunder, reverberating off the vaulted ceiling and marble columns with terrifying intensity. Instantly, the peaceful Sunday morning transformed into chaos as screams erupted from the congregation and people dove for cover behind the wooden pews that suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate as protection. Children wailed in terror, adults shouted in panic, and the smell of gunpowder began to mix with the lingering scent of Mrs. Morrison's lilac perfume and the coffee that had been brewing in the fellowship hall. The lead gunman at the back had drawn his weapon, a military-grade assault rifle that had no business in a house of worship, and was shouting demands that Margaret couldn't quite hear over the chaos. But she could read the situation in his body language and positioning. He was moving toward the front of the church, herding people like sheep, using fear and intimidation to establish control. His partners had also revealed their weapons and were beginning to execute what was clearly a well-rehearsed plan. "Everyone get down on the floor!" the leader screamed, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Hands where we can see them. Anyone who moves without permission gets shot." Margaret could see terrified faces peering over pew backs. Little Sarah Chen clutching her grandmother's hand. Businessman Robert Foster trying to shield his wife with his body. Teenage mother Jessica Martinez covering her baby with her own body while tears streamed down her face. These were her people, her congregation, her responsibility. For 32 years, she had watched over them from her loft, providing the musical soundtrack to their worship, their weddings, their funerals, their moments of joy and sorrow. But from her position in the organ loft, Margaret Hartley had advantages the attackers hadn't considered when they planned their assault. She had elevation, providing both concealment and superior sight lines. She had position, with the structural beams of the loft offering cover while still allowing her to observe and act. Most importantly, she had 30 years of the most specialized training the United States military had ever provided to a select few operators whose missions were so classified that their very existence was denied. While the congregation cowered in terror below, Margaret Hartley quietly transformed from church organist to what she had been trained to be 4 decades earlier, a weapon of surgical precision in the hands of justice. Her arthritis-stiffened fingers, which had struggled with Bach's more complex passages in recent years, moved with sudden fluid precision to a hidden panel beside the organ bench. The panel was invisible to casual observation, designed to look like part of the decorative woodwork. But Margaret's fingertips found the concealed catch immediately. Inside the hidden compartment was something the church board had never seen on any building schematic or renovation plan: a custom-built sniper rifle, broken down into components and nestled in high-density foam padding that protected each piece from decades of temperature changes and humidity. Staff Sergeant Margaret Chen, her married name had been Hartley for 40 years now, adopted when she'd married a kind accountant who'd died of cancer 12 years into their marriage, had been the United States Army's finest marksman before anyone thought to question whether women belonged in combat roles. Officially, her service record listed her as a reconnaissance specialist and communications technician. Unofficially, she had eliminated 37 confirmed threats across 4 classified operations that the government still wouldn't acknowledge existed, in conflicts that had never been declared, and in countries where American forces had never officially been deployed. The rifle assembled in her hands like a prayer made physical, each component clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a Swiss watch. Bolt action, .308 caliber. With a custom scope, she had calibrated herself using the church's architecture as reference points. She had installed this fail-safe in the organ loft on her very first day as St. Peter's organist 32 years ago, understanding even then that retirement from her particular line of work was more of a hopeful suggestion than a guarantee. Some enemies had long memories, and some skills were too valuable and too dangerous to ever truly be put to rest. Below, the situation was deteriorating with military precision as the attackers executed their plan. The team leader had reached the altar area and was now using Pastor Williams as a human shield, pressing the barrel of his rifle against the young minister's temple while barking orders at the terrified congregation. Margaret could see the pastor's lips moving in what was probably prayer, his face pale but determined to maintain some semblance of calm for his flock. "Everyone listen carefully," the leader shouted, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the sanctuary. "We're here to send a message about your government's crimes against our people. You're going to help us deliver that message, or you're going to become part of it permanently." The second gunman was systematically collecting cell phones from the congregation, smashing each device under his boot after checking for emergency calls that might have been made in the first moments of the attack. His partner was positioning people in the center aisle, away from the exits, creating a concentrated group that would be easier to control and harder for law enforcement to rescue without civilian casualties. Margaret calculated the tactical variables with computer-like precision. 3 targets, multiple civilians in the line of fire, marble surfaces that would cause unpredictable ricochets, and the acoustic properties of the sanctuary that would make her shots sound like they came from everywhere and nowhere. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the gunmen realized someone was missing from their head count, maybe 2 minutes before they thought to check the organ loft that had been hidden in shadow during their initial sweep. Her first shots had to be perfect. They all did. Margaret settled into the shooting position she had maintained thousands of times across 3 decades of service, her body automatically assuming the proper stance despite 40 years of civilian life. Her breathing slowed and deepened. Her heart rate dropped to the steady rhythm she had trained herself to achieve under extreme stress, and her vision tunneled to the crisp clarity that came when adrenaline and training combined into something approaching superhuman focus. The first shot Margaret fired was from 147 feet at a 38-degree downward angle, threading between the decorative wooden beams of the organ loft and past the hanging chandelier that had been installed in 1959. The bullet found its target in the left shoulder of the gunman holding Pastor Williams, a precisely calculated disabling shot that would neutralize the threat without killing unnecessarily. This wasn't a war zone anymore, and different rules applied to civilian environments, but the precision required was actually greater than anything she had achieved in military operations. The terrorist's rifle clattered to the marble floor as he spun away from Pastor Williams, clutching his wounded shoulder and screaming in shock and pain. The young pastor immediately dropped behind the solid oak altar, following protocol Margaret had quietly suggested to him years earlier during a casual conversation about emergency preparedness that he had probably forgotten until this moment. The second gunman spun toward the organ loft, raising his weapon toward the source of the shot, but Margaret was already adjusting for her next target. Her second shot was a surgical masterpiece of precision shooting, striking the terrorist's rifle at exactly the right angle to send it spinning out of his hands without causing serious injury to the man himself. The weapon skittered across the floor and lodged under one of the pews completely out of reach. "What the hell?" The third gunman started to shout, but his words were cut off as he realized his entire operation was falling apart in a matter of seconds. He began swinging his rifle wildly, trying to locate the source of the shots while keeping his remaining weapon trained on the congregation. Margaret's third shot demonstrated why she had been considered the finest marksman in Army Special Operations history. The bullet ricocheted off the marble floor at a mathematically perfect angle, striking the third gunman's ankle and dropping him immediately without any risk to the civilians nearby. All 3 threats neutralized, all 3 terrorists alive but completely unable to continue their attack. The entire engagement had lasted 97 seconds from first shot to complete neutralization. As sirens wailed in the distance, someone had managed to call 911 during the initial chaos, probably Mrs. Patterson, who always kept her phone in easy reach. Margaret carefully disassembled her rifle with the same methodical precision she had used to assemble it. Each component returned to its designated place in the hidden compartment, the foam padding ensuring no telltale rattling or shifting that might give away the secret she had kept for 32 years. By the time the first police officers burst through the heavy oak doors of St. Peter's Methodist Church, weapons drawn and tactical gear gleaming, Margaret was back at her organ bench with her hands folded primly in her lap, looking for all the world like any other startled parishioner who had just witnessed a terrifying, but thankfully brief, act of violence. "Police! Is everyone all right?" Officer Brady called out, his service weapon sweeping the sanctuary as he assessed the scene. Behind him, 6 more officers poured through the entrance, moving with practiced efficiency to secure the building and check for additional threats. The 3 terrorists lay on the marble floor in various states of incapacitation, wounded but alive, disarmed but conscious enough to be interrogated. Their weapons were scattered and harmless, their carefully planned attack reduced to complete failure in less than 2 minutes by an enemy they had never seen coming. "We are now," Pastor Williams said shakily, emerging from behind the altar and staring up at the organ loft with an expression of amazement and dawning comprehension. "Thanks to Mrs. Hartley." The young minister's voice carried clearly through the sanctuary, and every head turned to look up at the organ loft where Margaret sat in perfect composure, her floral dress unwrinkled, her silver hair still perfectly arranged in its neat bun, her reading glasses hanging undisturbed from their delicate gold chain. To the officers and paramedics now flooding into the building, she appeared to be exactly what she had always seemed, a mild-mannered church organist who played hymns on Sunday mornings and never caused anyone any trouble. But the way the congregation looked at her had fundamentally changed. They had heard the shots, had seen their attackers fall with surgical precision, had watched their beloved organist emerge from what should have been impossible circumstances with calm authority that spoke of experience far beyond anything a small-town church musician should possess. Questions were beginning to form in their minds. Questions about the quiet widow who had served their church so faithfully for over 3 decades. Questions about skills that seemed far too professional for someone whose official biography included nothing more exciting than teaching piano lessons and volunteering at the local library. The FBI arrived within 43 minutes, led by Agent Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the Bureau's Domestic Terrorism Unit, who had responded to more church attacks than she cared to remember. But she had never seen anything quite like the scene that greeted her at St. Peter's Methodist Church. 3 would-be terrorists neutralized with a level of precision that spoke of military training, yet no security personnel visible, no evidence of professional protection services, just a congregation of ordinary people led by a young pastor and supported by an elderly organist. Agent Martinez approached the organ loft with careful steps, her experienced eyes taking in details that the local police had missed. The angles of the shots, the precision of the wounds, the tactical assessment that had allowed someone to neutralize 3 armed men without causing a single civilian casualty. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't amateur hour. "Mrs. Hartley," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the respectful tone reserved for people who had just performed the impossible. That was some remarkable shooting. Margaret looked down at the FBI agent with the same mild expression she wore when discussing hymn selections with Pastor Williams. "I don't know what you mean, dear," she replied in the soft, grandmotherly voice that had become familiar to everyone at St. Peter's. "I was playing the organ when those terrible men attacked our church. Such a frightening experience for all of us." Agent Martinez smiled with the knowing expression of someone who had spent her career dealing with people who had secrets worth keeping. "Ma'am, I've been studying ballistics and tactical situations for 15 years. Those weren't lucky shots. They were surgical strikes performed by someone with extensive training and exceptional skill. Margaret's smile remained perfectly pleasant and utterly unrevealing. Perhaps you should speak with the local police about conducting a proper investigation, Agent Martinez. I'm sure they'll be able to explain everything to your satisfaction. It took the FBI's investigative team 3 days and considerable resources to uncover Margaret's true identity. And even then, they only scratched the surface of her classified history. Staff Sergeant Margaret Chen's service record was mostly redacted, hidden behind layers of national security classifications and compartmentalized information that required special clearances to access. What they could discover painted a picture of one of the most effective special operations soldiers in Army history, a woman whose confirmed kills during classified missions had helped prevent international incidents that could have destabilized entire regions of the world. When Agent Martinez returned to the church the following Sunday, she found Margaret at her usual place, playing the prelude as congregants filed in. The FBI agent waited until the service ended before approaching. "We need to talk," Martinez said quietly. "I'm sure I don't know what about," Margaret replied, closing her hymnal. "The 3 men you subdued. They were part of a domestic terrorist cell. They'd been planning attacks on churches across the state. Your actions likely saved dozens of lives." Margaret began descending the narrow stairs from the loft. "I told you, Agent Martinez. I was playing the organ." Mrs. Hartley, or should I say, Staff Sergeant Chen Margaret, stopped halfway down the stairs. "That person doesn't exist anymore. She was discharged 40 years ago. Maybe officially, but skills like yours don't just disappear." At the bottom of the stairs, Margaret turned to face the agent. For just a moment, the facade slipped, and Agent Martinez saw the soldier underneath the church organist's modest exterior. "Some skills," Margaret said quietly, "are never really retired. They just wait. The Bureau could use someone with your perspective." Margaret almost smiled. "Agent Martinez, I've been protecting this congregation for 32 years. Every Sunday, I sit up there and watch every entrance, every face, every movement. I know when Mrs. Patterson's arthritis is acting up by how she holds her purse. I can tell when the teenager in the 3rd row is planning to skip out early by the way he shifts in his seat. This is my post now, and if something like this happens again..." Margaret's eyes flicked toward the organ loft, then back to Agent Martinez. "Then those people up there should continue to question why I always sit where I can see every entrance." 3 weeks later, the church board met to discuss security measures in light of the attack. Several members suggested hiring professional security, installing metal detectors, or requiring background checks for visitors. "I don't think that's necessary," said Board Chairman Robert Foster. "After all, we have Mrs. Hartley watching over us." Margaret Hartley continued playing organ at St. Peter's Methodist Church for 7 more years. During that time, the church experienced no security incidents whatsoever. Some attributed this to increased police patrols in the area. Others credited improved community outreach programs. But every Sunday, Margaret climbed those narrow wooden stairs to the organ loft, carrying her worn hymnal and positioning herself where she could see every entrance. Her fingers played hymns of faith and hope, while her eyes maintained a different kind of vigil, one that had kept her people safe for nearly 4 decades. On the day she finally retired, Margaret left a sealed envelope with Pastor Williams. Inside was a simple note. "The security system has been relocated. Your new organist has been briefed." The new organist was a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, recently discharged from the Marines after 2 tours overseas. She had an unusual request during her interview. She wanted to ensure her seat in the loft provided good sight lines to all entrances. "For acoustics," she explained with a slight smile. Pastor Williams approved her request immediately. Some traditions, after all, are worth preserving. As Margaret Hartley walked out of St. Peter's Methodist Church for the last time as its organist, she paused at the main entrance. The brass plaque beside the door read, "All are welcome here." Below it, someone had recently added a smaller sign. "This house of worship, protected by faith, hope, love, and excellent security." Margaret smiled. The first genuinely relaxed smile she'd allowed herself in 40 years of service. Her watch was ended, but the mission continued. Some guardians wear uniforms. Others wear floral dresses and carry hymnals. But they all share one thing in common. They never really stop watching over their people. In the end, the congregation of St. Peter's Methodist Church learned something important that October morning. Sometimes the most unassuming person in the room is exactly the one you want on your side when everything goes wrong. Nobody questioned why the church organist always sat where she could see every entrance. They never should have had to question it at all.